Hey, folks, welcome to the Battles of the First World War podcast. Joining us on the podcast this evening is David Borys, author of Punching Above Our Weight, the Canadian Military at War since 1867. From the publishing Dundurn Press website, Punching Above Our Weight takes readers on a riveting exploration spanning 150 years of Canadian forces. This photograph-rich history of 150 years of the Canadian military forces traces the evolution of the country's armed forces from a small, underfunded, poorly trained militia to the modern, effective military it is today. From the Red River Resistance to the Boer War, through the World Wars, to modern peacekeeping and the Long War in Afghanistan, David A. Borys details the conflicts and operations that Canadian soldiers have served in. He highlights the key battles, among them Amiens, the Scheldt Estuary, and Operation Medusa, the significant people, including Louis Riel, Arthur Currie, and Guy Simonds, and the decisive moments, such as the passing of conscription in August 1917, Canada's declaration of war in 1939, and the peacekeeping crises of the 1990s that came to define the scope of Canada's participation in international conflicts and cement its global reputation. Borys also explores the challenges that the Canadian nation and its military have faced over those years, including major cultural and demographic shifts, a continual struggle for resources from generally disinterested governments, battlefield failures, and notorious and shocking scandals, along with ever-changing global threats. Punching Above Our Weight brings to light a new perspective on the Canadian military and its place in the world. And now, a little about our guest as well. David Borys is a Canadian military historian and a faculty member at Langara College in Vancouver, British Columbia. His published works include a wide variety of topics in the realm of Canadian military history and have been printed in academic journals such as Canadian Military History Journal and in print media such as The Globe and Mail. His most recent book, titled Punching Above Our Weight, The Canadian Military at War since 1867, was published by Dundurn in 2024 and is an easy-to-read, single-volume history of the Canadian military at war. He has been seen on such television history programs as APTN's Nations at War, National Geographic's Hitler's Last Stand, and Knowledge Network's documentary Zuhalem, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. Mm-hmm. David is also the producer, writer, and host of the popular Canadian history podcast, Curious Canadian History, which has charted as high as top 10 on Apple's history podcast charts. Yay! That's pretty awesome.
Thanks, man.
So, David, thanks so much for coming on the show this evening. And I want to start off, I actually listened to one of your episodes just this morning, and it was on Canadian partisans in Yugoslavia during World War II. And I was like, you're kidding. And no, you are not. What a great story.
Oh, thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. Thanks. It's great to be here, man. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me about this.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've written a book, magnificent accomplishment. You've got a podcast. You're a history professor. So, and it is at Langara College.
Langara College. That's right. Yep.
Langara College. Okay. And then, so got to start off with this question. How and when did you become interested in history and military history? And what's your area of focus?
Well, that's a great question. When I was very young, I think I was 6, 7, 8 years old. I was fortunate enough to know my great-grandfather, and he served in the First World War, believe it or not, with the Canadian Corps. He was originally from Russia. He was a Russian immigrant who ended up at the age of 16 joining the Canadian Corps, and he fought in much of the major battles of the First World War. And I was like 6, 7, 8 years old, and I knew him, and I can remember speaking to him about the war and being obsessed with this idea that he fought in a war. And I just kind of, even though I had no idea what he was sort of talking about in any detail, it was something that really stuck with me. And that really began my interest in just trying to understand more about what my great-grandfather had gone through. And then when I was 12 years old, I read this really popular Canadian military history book. The book's called Vimy, and it's by a very famous Canadian author named Pierre Burton. And while the book itself, from an academic perspective, has some flaws, as a 12-year-old reading it, it really got me. It really hooked me. And I think it was those elements, and then learning more about my own family's history. My grandfather and my grandmother both served in the Second World War, and suddenly this sort of long service history of my family and these events that I was interested in turning into a teenager, all of this stuff really hooked me, and that really began my journey. And I have to say that for much of, it was very early in my life. I can remember being in high school and knowing that I really wanted to study military history. And finally, when I got into my graduate studies, that's when I really sort of narrowed down. And it was when I was doing my master's at the University of Alberta, my master's advisor, Scott Robertson, was asked me if I wanted to work in Canada or elsewhere. And I said, well, I'd really like to work in Canada. And he said, well, you better focus on Canadian military history. And that began my journey. And I would say that my expertise is in the World Wars, so World War One and World War Two.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. Okay. So I wrote this in our shared Google Doc here for our listeners outside of Canada. And like I said, I'm going to claim horrible ignorance here of my neighbor to the north. Can you give us a brief overview of Canada's history
Sure.
and when it gained independence from the British Empire? So reason I ask is, why did you choose 1867 as the starting point for your book?
Yeah, so 1867 is technically the year that Canada becomes a country. So as some background for the listeners, and then first of all, Mike, it's totally understandable. I mean, learning the history of another country outside of one's own country is always very difficult. So I'm really actually grateful that I get an opportunity to talk about my country here on your podcast. And so anyhow, 1867 is the year that Canada becomes a country. Now, a bit of background: Canada was a collection of British colonies prior to formation of a country. So a series of colonies, much like the 13 colonies of the Atlantic seaboard were before they formed into the United States of America. So too were a series of colonies known as British North America that in 1867 amalgamated into a country that was Canada. It's important to understand, though, that even though Canada was a country in 1867, it was very much still run by Britain. So the London Parliament and in London, England, very much determined much of what was going on. Effectively, the best way to understand it is the country that was Canada could run its own domestic affairs, but anything internationally, and it would be run by the Parliament and colonial advisors in London, England. And over the course of the next 100 and somewhat years, there was sort of a series of events occurred, and the First World War is actually going to be very important in this, that showed Canada sort of emerging as a mature nation. And in fact, the First World War, and we'll talk more about this later, but the First World War is actually going to be a catalyst for Canadian political leaders to start to say to Britain, hey, listen, even though you might be running our foreign affairs and our international diplomacy and trade, we have begun to sacrifice so much that we effectively want a bigger say in how our country's run. And in fact, interestingly enough, I would argue that Canada doesn't actually get its final aspect of full independence from Britain until 1982, believe it or not. Very complicated constitutional discussion, but needless to say that a lot of historians say that the last vestiges of British control of Canada were shed in 1982.
I had in my head, the figure 1980 swirling up in there somewhere of related to Canadian independence. So I was wow. I was very, very young, but I was already born when Canada gained its full independence. Wow.
Yeah, the last vestiges of it. I mean, I don't want to make it seem like we weren't an independent country. We certainly were by the 1980s, but there was sort of the last bits of our constitution that were controlled by Britain were finally sort of given back to us and called what we call the repatriation of our constitution. And that was sort of the last vestiges of the old imperial control finally fully in Canadian hands.
So one amazing thing is hearing from you, your Russian great-grandfather who served in the Canadian forces, and then going back to your podcast with Canadian operatives working with the Yugoslav partisans who were themselves Yugoslav immigrants to Canada. It's really, really interesting to hear, like, Canada's story is obviously one of immigrants as well.
Yes.
Amazing. Okay. So thanks for that introduction. And now we'll get into your book here and your introduction to Punching Above Our Weight. You note some misconceptions about Canadian military history, and I'll list them there. Some of these misconceptions are that there is no military history to begin with, that if there is, it has had no impact on national development, that it's just defined by a few events, and that it's unimportant. Is that the reason for the book, to correct these misconceptions? And who's your primary audience?
That's a great question. Well, I'll start with the primary audience. So my primary audience is certainly, I mean, I identify them as the layperson, just people in general who have an interest in military history or interest in Canadian history, don't know much about it, and they want effectively an easy access into it as something that is written by a historian that is based on the current literature, the current research. So this isn't made up. This is definitely rooted in very, very good historiography that's being done, but is written in a way that doesn't sort of bog you down in academic lingo and academic talk, right?
Gotcha.
So just a very accessible single volume entrance into Canadian military history. And that was and I thought about my father. I think about some of my friends. I think about my friends' parents, just people that like history, but not, or maybe not like you and I, maybe deep diving into it all the time. So want something a bit more accessible, so a platform to launch from. And that was who my primary audience was. And that stems, that connects with what you said at the beginning of your question, is that there is in Canada, unfortunately, a common series of misconceptions that our military history is either unimportant or non-existent. And I feel it's frustrating to say this because I've spent my life devoted to Canadian military history, and I know how important it is, and I know how existent it is. But I think for the average Canadian, we don't have an extensive education curriculum in our high schools that spends too much time on this stuff. So when you speak to, let's say, a 16 or 17-year-old Canadian, they might know a little bit about it, but there's certainly not a sort of deep understanding of how important it has been to Canada's shaping as a nation, to Canadian identity, to our place in the world today. There's a significant disconnect. A lot of young Canadians might know like the odd battle, they might know D-Day, they might know Vimy Ridge, things like that, but they don't understand that all of this is part and parcel of a long history of Canadian military activity, both internationally and domestically, that has contributed to the development of this nation and really been a significant contributor to where we are today. The fact that we have such great friends and allies around the globe is not because we didn't do anything. It's the exact opposite. It's because we did do something. We were always there when we could be. And you're there in New England. You're from the United States of America, and when 9/11 happened, it was America was on the ground, and then Canada was on the ground in Afghanistan, and that's what a good ally does, and that's what a good friend does, and it's things like that a lot of Canadians just don't know, that we are there for our friends when they need us. And now, granted, we're not the largest military on the planet. We're just a fraction of the military that the America has, but regardless, we are there when we need to be called upon, and we do a job, and we do a good job of it. And there's just unfortunately this disconnect between sort of a few battles or a few events in the past and very little understanding of how much that continues up to the modern day.
Question for you regarding Canadians and military service. We have a similar disconnect in the United States, and I think that's may have something to do with our transition into a volunteer military in the 1970s. With the end of Vietnam, the draft ended. And while that's certainly, a good thing, in all volunteer military, you have more motivated personnel coming into the military who want to serve. It also has, interest in the military has waned, and so like you get less people going into the service, and so you have a lot of folks who simply have like no connection to the military. Whereas my father-in-law, who he was a child of the 1950s. He was drafted, did his 3 or 4 years, got his tattoo with his buddies, and that was it. But like he knew it. He knew what the Army was, and he had a connection to the military. But nowadays, like a lot of young people, they don't see the military as a viable option for their future. Is Canada experiencing something similar?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we are. So Canada never had a similar. We've had conscription at different points in our history. It's always been very, very temporary. We had it late in the First World War, late in the Second World War. Yeah. We never had it after the end of the Second World War, unlike the United States. But currently today, for instance, we're 10,000 personnel short of our quota right now. we have a very serious problem in this country where really viable candidates for our military just simply do not see it as some sort of career. They do not see it as an option. And I'm 43. My time is my opportunities to serve in the military are long gone. And so it's easier for me to sit here in a comfortable chair, to say this. But the fact is that we do have a disconnect, and we do have a need for people to serve. And unfortunately, and this is a big conversation we probably don't have time for today, but for a variety of reasons, we just do not have that sort of motivation amongst young people to do their part or to serve our country. And it's problematic. And this is part and parcel of why Canada is struggling right now in sort of the international arena, especially considering how volatile the international arena is today.
Right. Thanks for that. Okay. So as Battles of the First World War podcast focuses on the Great War, your Great War chapters are the ones that I read the most closely. So getting into that, what was Canada's entry into the First World War like? You brought up some interesting demographics that came up during August of 1914.
Yeah, great question. So to begin with, let's take a look at Canada's military on the eve of the First World War. We don't have a navy, or a navy to speak of, I should say. We have a little like tin pot navy, but it's nothing relevant. We have no air force. We have about 3,000 regulars in the army. What would be the equivalent of the army? We have about 60,000 militia on paper. So today we call them the reserves, but effectively part-time soldiers, much like state militia in the United States. Yep. And the idea was that war breaks out, that those 3,000 regulars with those 60,000 militia would make up sort of the bulk of a fighting force, effectively. So in 1914, when Britain declares war, Canada is automatically at war. We do not have a choice. We are automatically at war. And what's really interesting is in the first weeks after the declaration of war, there's a lot of enthusiasm, especially in the cities of Canada. And we see Vancouver and Toronto, Montreal even, and Winnipeg and Halifax, all these many cities, all people rushing to them. But it's really important to identify that the vast majority of those who are flocking to these recruiting stations are either born in Britain and or first generation descendants of those born in Britain. So we're talking about white Anglophones who are flocking to the colors. And this is a really important thing because while we do speak of Canada going to war, in that first year, it was very much British Canada going to war. And that changes over the course of it, but there's no doubt in that first year, and when you look at the first contingent and even the second contingent that go over, largely English speaking of British heritage.
Amazing. So how did the Canadians perform during the first 2 years of the war, from late 1914 to about late 1916, after the conclusion of the Battle of the Somme?
I think the period 1914 to 1916 can be described as both a baptism of fire and also a learning curve. So if we were to look at some of the key moments, I would say we start with the battle, the second battle of Ypres in April 1915. Your listeners might know it as the first gas attack. It's sort of the first time that gas is used by the Germans in an sort of en masse in an offensive operation, try to capturing the Belgian city of Ypres. And in April 1915, the 1st Canadian Division, so this is the first contingent, has been converted into this division. They are on the front lines protecting Ypres, kind of in the salient around the city. To their left is a North African division, which fighting for the French as part of the French Empire and the French Imperial troops. And the French soldiers are overwhelmed by the gas attack. Absolutely no preparation. Obviously, there's no masks yet. There's nothing like that, right? The French territorials retreat in a flood. The Germans come in the gap, and the Canadians end up fighting this grueling battle for days and days and days, and eventually are able to sort of plug the gap and hold off this German advance at the city of Ypres. And why this is so interesting is we have to understand that the Canadian division that fought the Germans there, these are not professional soldiers. These were effectively either part-time soldiers, and many of them had never soldiered before in their life, and they're up against arguably one of the finest armies on the planet at the day. I mean, the German army was a very well-trained, well-equipped professional army, and yet the Canadians were able to hold them back. And that kind of sets the tone for the next while. From 1915 into 1916, the Canadians end up engaging in a series of these battles. Now, I want to make it really clear. They do not win every battle. They lose, they make mistakes, but they learn how to fight. And as you know, the fighting in the First World War is something that no one has ever predicted before. It is absolutely a different style of combat. It is a different level of violence, and it is such a phenomenal sort of different aspect of fighting, and a different battlefield than people are used to. I always joke with my students that had you written about the First World War in 1912, you would have been a science fiction writer, not a predictor of history, right? And so it's phenomenal to watch the Canadians sort of evolve and adapt and develop their fighting doctrine. They lose some battles, they win some battles. What's interesting is by the time we get to the Somme offensive, so as your listeners probably know, 1st of July, 1916, of the worst day in the history of the British military. Nonetheless, the Somme offensive goes on and on and on. And what you have is a situation in September of 1916, the Canadians end up being thrust into a battle called the Battle of Flers-Courcelette. And this is an interesting battle for two reasons. Number one, this is the first time the British used tanks in the First World War. So the Canadians advance using these land battleships, these Mark I land battleships, these brutal, they're awful tanks, not the tanks we understand today, right. But they certainly scare the bejesus out of the Germans in that first attack. And what's even more important, though, and what we see is when the Canadians fight in September of 1916, even though they have these tanks, which helps to a minimal degree, the Canadians will eventually gain more territory than any single British unit that fights during the entire Somme offensive, meaning that the Battle of Flers-Courcelette is the most successful British imperial battle of the entire Somme offensive, and that's the Canadians that do that. In November of 1916, as the Somme offensive wraps up, the Canadians then will go and capture a trench that's called Regina Trench, which is one of the key German defensive positions in the front that the British are facing. And again, this is the Canadians sort of being thrust into what is a very difficult position and doing their job. So I think by the time we get to the end of 1916, there is a sense that the Canadians, and now they're the Canadian Corps, now they're the combination of a couple of divisions at this point, there's a sense that these Canadians are starting to be able to figure out this battlefield, and their leaders, their officers, and the soldiers that are surviving are becoming very, very effective at executing tactical doctrine on this muddy, bloody, trench-ridden, detritus battlefield, and they're doing it very effectively.
Yeah, it's really amazing. I've read several accounts in other histories of the Canadians, and they start to be referred to as shock troops, with the Germans, and they have this quality of like when the Canadians come in, man, like the BEF means business, and
yes,
they really want that objective because like. The Canadians are coming in. And then this also, I believe, contributes to this growing national identity of as you mentioned in your book, Canadianness. That like these guys are like fighting, they're winning on the battlefield, particularly in the later years of the war. And this is building up camaraderie and an esprit de corps, but also a sense of national pride. Is that right? Like,
absolutely. Yeah, I would say that as those first recruits who eagerly joined the Canadian Expeditionary Force unfortunately die off or get wounded or move up the ranks, more and more of what you might call Canadians as opposed to British Canadians, and I know that seems like an odd distinction, but it really is an important distinction. More and more of these Canadians, meaning Swedish descent, even German descent, Norwegian descent, French descent, like all of these Canadians who come like this, the melting pot, the cultural mosaic, they all start joining the ranks. And the British element, although the British identity will always be strong because Canada is still part of the British Empire, but there is this shift from this sort of very British Canadian army to a much more multicultural Canadian army, and not just. And I shouldn't just say French, European Canadians, but we have Black Canadians start joining. We have thousands of Indigenous Canadians will eventually sign up. So this is a very interesting shift. The demographic shift starts to maybe, in my opinion, and many of my colleagues, it starts to represent more of what Canada is, as opposed to that first year and a half when it was just sort of the British Canadians that were sort of joining up. So I do think we start to sense a bit of a identity shift and a bit of this national pride in, oh, this is more what Canada kind of means to us in this time.
Wow. So you've got the 4 Canadian divisions. They eventually turn into the Canadian Corps. So how did they evolve into that corps that like executes this well-planned attack at Vimy Ridge in April of 1917? And how did Canadian military reputation stand in the later years of World War One? So 1917, 1918.
So over the course of 1915 and 1916, more and more contingents keep arriving, and basically as each contingent arrives, it's sort of formed into basically another division. And what you have is 1 division, 2 divisions by the Somme, then you have a 3rd division shortly after. And by the time we get to Vimy Ridge, you have 4 divisions. So we're talking about a corps the size of about 80,000 to 100,000 soldiers. I mean, this is a punching force, right? This is a serious punching power corps formation. And when we get to Vimy Ridge, there's a couple things that I think are really important. Number one of the unique features of the corps is that, unlike other British corps formations, the British were not allowed to willy-nilly pull a Canadian division out and just put it somewhere else. So if you were any other British corps formation, if you had 3 or 4 divisions in your order of battle, you could have that division pulled every month. You could have a new division put in. Because Canada had this sort of semi-national, semi-autonomous status within the larger BEF, there was this sort of understanding, and this was made very clear from Ottawa, our nation's capital, that we don't want our divisions just being spread out amongst the British forces. We want our Canadian divisions fighting as Canadians side by side. And what this meant, and this is so important, is that so many officers from the division to the brigade to the battalion level and up into the corps level all kept serving with each other over and over and over again. So by the time you get to Vimy Ridge in April of 1917, so this is 2 years after the Battle of Second Ypres, you have a number of officers that have simply worked together. Not all of them are Canadian officers, many, many, many British officers, but the point is you have this sort of what we call today corporate continuity. You have a bunch of people who simply just work together. And as you know, in any sort of environment, if you have a bunch of people who work together lots, they're just going to be more effective. And this is one of the reasons why by the time we get to Vimy Ridge, the Canadian Corps is able to execute so effectively. Now, there is a bunch of other stuff going on, and I'm more than happy to get into that. But the point here is that from Vimy Ridge onwards, and you talked about shock troops, from Vimy Ridge onwards, that is where that reputation is cemented. Because as many of your listeners probably know, Vimy Ridge was considered this impregnable German defensive position, and yet within 4 days, it is entirely captured by the Canadians. Where the British and the French could not do it, the Canadians did. And they do it in such a rapid way. On the first day alone, 85% of the ridge is captured. It's an incredible tactical achievement. It really is. And from then on, it's very clear that the Canadian Corps is a special formation in the British sort of order of battle. And from then on, you see battle after battle after battle after battle. The Canadians win and they win and they win. And like you mentioned before, to the point where the Germans start saying wherever the Canadians are going to line up, that's where the attacks come in. And so the Germans themselves are writing about the Canadians as British shock troops. They're recognized by their enemy as these elite troops. By the time you get to 1918, you have what the famous 100 days, the final 100 days of the war, right? Launches on August 8th, 1918. And so you have the British, the Americans, the French, and the Belgians all launching their own offensives. Well, of course, who do the British pick to spearhead their offensive? It's the Canadian Corps. And effectively, from the 8th of August to the 11th of November, 1918, the Canadian Corps fight a series of 5 major battles and a bunch of smaller ones, and literally punch right, punch left, punch right, punch left, and they just drive deep into the heart of the Hindenburg Line, shattering the major German defensive line of the Western Front and playing a central role in helping to shatter the entire German military resistance, bringing about the end of the war. So we're talking about, by 1918, undoubtedly, within the British military, the Canadian Corps is the finest corps formation. And I would argue, and this could be debatable for sure, I would argue that the Canadian Corps is the finest corps formation on the entire Western Front by 1918.
Ooh, right.
Yeah, very hot take right there, everyone.
Yeah. Well, okay. So maybe a little bit of a follow-up question that I think might lead you into talking a little bit more about their evolution is, can you speak a little bit about Arthur Currie and his
Sure.
Verdun report?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So that, and then we can turn that into a conversation about the evolving doctrine too, and that might explain to your listeners a little more why I made such a hot take back there, which could be controversial.
Yeah,
I know. So the Verdun report comes out in the aftermath of the French defensive battles around the city of Verdun. And what Arthur Currie did at the time, he was a division commander, and he went down to Verdun and he sort of studied what new tactical techniques were being employed by both the French and the Germans. And he returns to the Canadian Corps headquarters. At the time, the Canadian Corps was commanded by Julian Byng, a future Governor General of Canada, very, very fantastic general. And he sort of delivers this report. And this report has an incredible amount of recommendations on the way the Corps should move forward tactically and in terms of sort of fighting doctrine. And even like simple things we might take for granted, like creeping barrage, like platoon tactics, like greater emphasis on individual, on unit level tactics and unit level movement, like fire and movement, things like that. So there's a lot of ways in which this report sort of speaks to what we would recognize today as modern tactics, to be perfectly honest. And when Currie takes command of the Corps after the Battle of Amiens Ridge, Julian Byng is promoted to Army Commander, and Currie takes over. He and Byng, just to say, Byng does accept this report and he begins to implement a lot of these changes. But Currie, when he takes over, really goes about drilling the Corps and making sure that the division commanders and those below them embrace a lot of these modern tactics and modern ideas. And if I could just pinpoint a few of them, the first one is that Currie really believed that firepower was the key. And I know that sounds so silly, like as if we wouldn't agree with that. But he was adamant that the Corps would have more guns per soldier advancing than any other formation in the British Armed Forces. And so what you actually have is when Canadians advance by 1918, each Canadian soldier is supported by more shells and more machine guns than any other British soldier in an equivalent Corps formation. So we're talking about just a general firepower punch that's happening.
Yeah.
Another aspect that Currie was really huge on was engineers and the ability to move across the battlefield. And as you know, First World War battlefields were totally torn up. Absolutely, detritus and shell holes and everything was destroyed. And Arthur Currie ends up rearranging and reforming his engineers into these engineer brigades. And these brigades are sort of self-contained engineer units with labor to do the work, with pioneers, with engineers, and they're much more successfully employed on the battlefield so they can move to a spot quicker. They have all the tools they need to overcome objectives, and they can quickly sort of create bridges or tramways or roadways, and they're so effective on the battlefield that it allows the Canadian Corps in the 100 days to advance. And then finally, I would also say that because of the continuity of the officers, of the continuity of leadership, Currie is dealing with people he's known for years by the time that we're talking about the 100 Days campaign. And I cannot underestimate that. He has some incredible staff officers that work for him. He has a bunch of people he knows who their wives are, who their kids are. We're talking about a level of intimacy that is very uncommon in a lot of British headquarters. And because of that, Currie is able to execute his vision in a way that so many Corps commanders simply can't. So many other Corps commanders in the British Expeditionary Force, they are dealing with different officers all the time. Here's a new division commander. Here's a new staff officer. I need to get to know them. Currie has very much the sort of continuous level of interaction with the same people. And you can imagine, I don't think it's hard to explain how effective that would be if you're trying to carry out a vision.
Yeah, these are people who could probably finish his sentences for him.
Yeah, by 1918, certainly.
Yeah, they know how he's thinking. Oh, amazing. What does the end of the Great War bring to Canada's development as a nation?
Well, it brings a few things. So I'm going to start with the international, and then let me shift to the domestic after that.
Sure.
Internationally, it brings about very much this, for lack of a better word, an emergence of Canada on the international stage. There is no doubt that the work of the Canadian Corps gave the leverage for the Canadian government to lobby to Britain and frankly to the rest of the world to say we are not just some sort of subordinate nation within the British Empire. We are a nation that is equal to all the nations of the world. In fact, I want to bring your attention to something called Resolution 9, and this is a really interesting moment. In the aftermath of Vimy Ridge, our Prime Minister Robert Borden is in an Imperial War conference. So all the prime ministers of the dominions of the British Empire are all meeting with the British prime minister, and Vimy Ridge occurs, and it's celebrated across the English world, right? Like newspapers, headlines, the front page celebrating these Canadians that captured Vimy Ridge. And it is Vimy Ridge that allows Robert Borden to turn to the British government and say, listen, when this war is done, we want a reevaluation of our role within the larger British Empire. And most importantly, we do not want to be subordinate to Britain. We want to be an equal within the British Empire, still part of the crown and still loyal to the crown, but we want to be considered an equal to Britain within the British Empire, not a subordinate nation. And the British agree to Resolution 9, which is this agreement to reassess Canada's role in the British Empire and reassess the roles of the dominions. So that is a very direct relationship between a battle that Canada fought, the success that Canada had, and the future shaping of Canada within the larger British Empire. So there is no doubt, internationally speaking, that the First World War is very much the coming out party for Canada on the international stage. It's the Sweet 16. It's the graduation from high school. It's you're now an adult. Whatever metaphor you want to use, that happens. However, I will say that domestically, it's not as rosy. In late 1917, the Canadian government passes conscription, and conscription is deemed to be vital to continuing the momentum of operations that the Canadian Corps is involved in. Now, conscription is very contentious, especially between French Canadians and English Canadians. Mm-hmm. In much of Canada, there is this belief that French Canada was not pulling its weight, and the percentages are a bit tough to measure. It's for a variety of reasons. I won't get into that in general. It's not as important. The point here is that when the government passes conscription, French Canada reacts in riots. They feel that it's wrong that the government forces French Canadians to go overseas and fight, that it should be a volunteer army. And in 1918, there's a series of riots, and in fact, there's a series of deaths because of these riots. So it's a very sort of violent year. And in the aftermath of the war, there is significant tension between French and English Canada, and that persists, and that's going to be a big problem going forward for Canada. On top of it, and same with the United States of America, Canada enters into a recession in the immediate aftermath of the war, and there is this sort of the veterans are returning. Hundreds of thousands of veterans return to a country that now they don't have jobs, and it seems like there's labor issues everywhere, and it feels, frankly, like a lot of veterans are saying, what did we fight for? They're coming back to a country that they can't seem to get work, that there seems to be labor strikes on every corner. Many of the cities, Winnipeg, Vancouver, Toronto, there's strikes, there's violent strikes erupting. It feels very chaotic in the aftermath of the war. So I would argue that while internationally the war elevates Canada very much on the international stage, domestically it creates a significant amount of tension that is going to take years for the country to recover from.
Wow. So we've got, moving on from the Great War and Canada's participation in it, you've got, what other areas of Canadian military history do you explore in the book? You've got World War II and...
Yeah, we start, so 1867 we begin, and when Canada becomes a nation, and we start with sort of the first 40 years of Canada's existence. The Canadian military is basically trying to find its footing. We really are this sort of underfunded, undertrained, very, very sloppy military in the first decades, even though we do get involved in a series of domestic conflicts as the Canadian nation sort of expands west. And then we go into, at the turn of the century, at the end of the 19th century, Canada gets involved in the Boer War, which is the war in South Africa. We then deal with the First World War, the Second World War. That's a big chunk of the book, of course. And then a large section of the book is looking at peacekeeping and sort of our work with the United Nations in the post-Second World War era, not to exclude the Korean War, which, America obviously had played a central part in that, and Canadians were there and fighting alongside Americans and Australians and other Commonwealth troops during the Korean War. There's a number of peacekeeping operations I cover in the latter half of the 20th century, and then into Afghanistan. We spent a big chunk of time looking at Afghanistan. It's the longest war that Canada's ever fought in, and a very significant war. The Canadian military it does a fantastic job in terms of its tactical success on the ground. Sadly, and I should say the Canadians gained great reputation, both from their American and British counterparts. And anyone you meet from Afghanistan today who's a veteran, they will speak highly of the Canadian troops, as will Canadians of Americans and British. But the reality is, as we know, is much more complicated on the grand strategic level. And Afghanistan today, unfortunately, is a unfortunate outcome. The country is not in a good place in any way. we deal with Afghanistan, and then finally we finish with a few more of the modern examples of Canadian participation, primarily in the Eastern Europe and in North Africa. So really honestly covering the gamut. And I do want to make clear to your listeners, it's not just about the military on the home front. I do deal with a lot of domestic issues because I try to incorporate how are Canadian people relating to the military, and what are the governments of Canada doing or not doing to support the military as they say yes to all of these different types of operations. So it is trying to connect both the home front and the battlefront together through this sort of 150 years or so.
Yes, and I definitely saw that in your chapters on the Great War, and I appreciate it. And hopefully I'll remember to say this again at the end of the episode. But punching above our weight is now like I eagerly await someone to say, what's like a general great go-to book on Canadian history? Because I'm going to be like right there. That's
thank you.
To get. I mean, it's fantastic.
I really appreciate that.
There's so much. There's so much, David. There's like I've learned so much of it, and so much that like I didn't know. And I mean, frankly, a lot that makes sense. You know, like Canada's expansion westward and the conflicts that come as a result. I mean, we obviously in the United States we've had the same thing, and
yeah,
like I just never thought of it. But of course, like Canada's going to experience the same issues there. So,
well, Mike, I just want to say I appreciate you being an American. I do really appreciate you saying that, because it actually does make me feel like the book serves a purpose, especially when someone who, like you said, doesn't necessarily have so much background. And I'm sure you know a lot about Canada in the First World War because, of course, of your own personal interest in the war. But to hear that it really kind of justifies why I write these books, why I wrote this book.
So in these books, do you have a figure in Canada's military history or maybe even like related history that really resonates with you?
It's interesting. So so I mean, just full disclosure for your listeners, I was thinking about this question a lot before this interview, because I never in a weird way, I never really get too attached to the people I write about, but I do want to talk about Arthur Currie. And this might seem like a cop out for people who know Canadian military history. Of course, he's going to talk about the greatest general that Canada ever put on the field. But the reason I want to talk about Arthur Currie is this. Arthur Currie was, before the First World War broke out, he was a real estate agent in Victoria, British Columbia. He was a part-time teacher then in Ontario. He was a part-time soldier in the militia. He had some financial troubles. He was rather rotund gentleman, a bit of like, they called him pear-shaped, believe it or not. And really? Nothing about him said soldier. Right. Nothing about him said professional soldier. And yet, in the course of the First World War, he comes to command the Canadian Corps, and near the end of the First World War, David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, is actually thinking of Currie becoming the next commander-in-chief. This is a true fact. This is in the documents. Wow. David Lloyd George is saying, if we relieve Douglas Haig, what about Arthur Currie? This is a conversation that's going on. So not only does he come from these very humble backgrounds, but he then, through his intelligence, through thinking about the battlefield, rises to this very respected position at the end of the war. And here's the kind of the kicker, is when the war ends, he comes back, and he really comes back, and there's no celebration, there's no parade. Our parliament doesn't even thank him publicly. They sort of mumble something on the side. There's no sort of moment that they say, thank you, Arthur Currie. You know, for instance, like Douglas Haig is knighted or further knighted, I should say. He's given all these decorations. He's given British Parliament formally thanks him, gives him a huge bunch of money. Arthur Currie gets none of that. Now Arthur Currie goes on to lead McGill University, and he really helps turn McGill University into one of the foremost Canadian educational institutions. But the point is that he's sort of forgotten as a commander. And I think the reason I bring that up, and the reason why his story resonates with me, is that it's something Canadian about us, is that we sort of want to do the job, and then when it comes to talking about our military service and celebrating, or at the very least commemorating openly and publicly our veterans, we sometimes seem to be a country that doesn't do that enough. And in my opinion, we don't do that enough, certainly. And I think Arthur Currie's story is emblematic of the general attitude of Canada. We'll go do the job, but once it's over, We don't really want to like put your name up in the lights. We don't want to have a bunch of books written about you. We don't want to have a parade for you. And it's a very odd feature of Canada and our relationship to our military history and our military today, is that we feel very ambivalent or standoffish about anything that smacks of militarism and or celebrating or commemorating our military. We have Remembrance Day every year on November 11th, and it's still well attended, but it's every other day. Anything that sort of tries to celebrate the military, many Canadians get really up in their hackles about it, thinking that somehow this is sort of militaristic, as if in negative terms, and not just saying, look at the good work our military and our military service personnel are doing. And it's an unfortunate reality of Canada today. And I hope my book can somehow maybe show people that it's okay to talk about our military, and to say, you know what, it's okay to celebrate those who served our country, and to say, thank you for your service. Thank you for the work you've done. We've won some battles. That doesn't mean we need to be a militaristic nation, but It doesn't mean we have to ignore what our country's done as well. And I think for me, Arthur Currie's story sort of embodies that struggle and that frustration that I have in the current climate.
I know you just said Canadians don't like to write a whole bunch of books about their leaders and stuff like that, but could you name like a biography of Arthur Currie that you would recommend?
Sure. Well, there is one of my favorite books is by Tim Cook.
Okay, I know that name.
Yeah, so he does a great book that looks at Sam Hughes and Arthur Currie, and it's a very great book. I mean, to be honest, if I'm going to be honest, I would just read everything that Tim Cook writes pretty much. I mean,
I've heard that too.
he's phenomenal, and he's done such great work. He does a 2-volume history of Canada in the First World War. The title escapes me right now, but Google Tim Cook and you'll find this wonderful 2-volume history of the First World War, and it's phenomenal. And for you, Mike, I highly recommend it, especially.
Got it. You got it. So I'm just going to write anything by him. Well, awesome. All right. And so I've got my last question here for you. Now that Punching Above Our Weight is out in the world and being read by folks, any future projects in the works?
Yes, I'm almost embarrassed to say this in a way, but I'm actually switching to historical fiction, believe it or not.
Really?
Yeah, there's a very interesting story late in the Second World War. I won't go into huge details, but basically where American, German, Austrian, and French soldiers all end up fighting together against an SS brigade. It's a very fascinating tale, and I really wanted to write about it, and I decided I would try my hand at historical fiction. So I've begun writing a historical fiction novel. I'm not sure what the title is. I don't even know if it'll be any good, Mike, but I sure hope when it comes out that it'll be something people read.
Oh, no way. There's nothing wrong with that. I think fiction is a great way of introducing folks. I was just seeing something that somebody was saying, like, if you don't think like fiction is a good introduction to like warfare, like you've got to, you need to change your thinking. Like,
yes.
I think, if anything, it just generates that interest. And like, it's like what I think about films. Like I have not seen the film Napoleon. I know a lot of people were kind of on it, for lack of a better word right now. But my thing is like, you know what? Sure, the film is probably historically inaccurate, but if you get a person interested into where they say, like, you know what, that guy kind of interests me, I'd like to go look up a book on him. Like, I see that as a win. And seeing, you putting out some interesting, fun, entertaining historical fiction on World War II, and then somebody's like, you know what? Let me go in the back of David's book here and let me see like his sources. And now I want to hear the real story, So I think it's great.
And that you're absolutely right. And that's, I mean, in many ways, that's what Punching Above Our Weight's supposed to do too. I mean, I want more people to learn about history. I mean, and I think you do too. Why would we do a podcast if we didn't want more and more people to access this material? And I think you and me we're cut from the same cloth. We want more and more people to be interested in this stuff and learn about this stuff. And that's a positive all around. And so whatever venue, whatever medium, whatever way you want people to get into it, that's fantastic in my mind. And that's why I think I'm okay with switching to historical fiction for a shot and giving it a try.
Very cool. Very cool. David, thank you so much for taking time out of your evening and for coming on the show, man. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it was my absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.